So welcome to 2020. That's right, it's a little bearish this year, but and really for the 20s period. This is a whole new century of the 20s. 2020 is a decade of a lot of uncertainty. It is a decade that has a lot of controversy to it. From Nostradamus all the way up to modern day economists, people have predicted how this decade would turn out for mankind, and it could actually be a very scary conversation. This is a video that's going to talk about per capita. For those of you who don't know what the phrase per capita means, it is a Latin phrase that means per head. The belief is that we are in a finite world. We have exceeded the ecological capacity of Earth with population. Our natural resources are starting to become less abundant than the population. We have crossed that gap. It's a simple mathematical problem. As population grows, the greater the population, the less resources there are. That does not mean the end of the world. That does not mean that you as an independent individual cannot go out and succeed. That does not mean that society has to fall apart. This world is not as finite as we believe it to be. And if the way of thinking is that we live in a finite world, a finite society, then we will never be able to exceed our limitations as individuals. We'll never be able to exceed our limitations as a society. This is a video for people who can think independently, a video for people who can open their minds and look to the future, look for strategies, and develop solutions. But in order for us to develop those solutions, we have to recognize the problem, we have to recognize how we got here politically, and then we can look at steps that we can move forward. So this thought process that we live in a finite world and population is getting too big and we're running out of resources is actually a very, very dangerous thought process. And the reason for that is, yes, population is growing, and maybe it's exceeded the ecological capacity of Earth. But when we try and control population, especially with some of the techniques that they've used, what we're actually doing is we're devaluing the lives of others. We're discounting the rights of others. And the day that we discount and devalue the lives of other people is the day that we discount and devalue the lives of ourselves. You can't possibly have that moral towards others without having it towards yourself. And so it's a very dangerous thought process. It's one that's going to cause a lot of conflict moving forward. And so I wanted to throw that out there because population control, the whole thought of it, is a very wrong concept. Population, Mother Nature, all of those things, if left alone, it will take care of itself in time. Everything always adjusts. We shouldn't be trying to implement those changes ourselves because of the simple fact that it creates a very, very dangerous situation, a very dangerous thought process. So back in the 1970s, the Club of Rome came up with a computer model that basically simulated population growth and what happens to resources over time.
It's not some science fantasy effect from 2001. This electronic display, emanating from Australia's largest computer, is a picture of the condition, past, present, and future of planet Earth. The program was originally devised by a scientist working from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, J. Forrester. It was developed under the auspices of the Club of Rome by an MIT research team to present a complex model of the world and what we humans are doing to it. What it does for the first time in man's history on the planet is to look at the world as one system. It shows that Earth cannot sustain present population and industrial growth for much more than a few decades. It shows that simply cleaning up our car exhausts and making some small effort to limit our families simply isn't enough. It's like an electronic guided tour of our global behavior since 1900 and where that behavior will lead us. Down the left-hand side of the graph is the date, 1900, 1940, 1980, 2020, right down to 2060.
That computer model came up with a lot of interesting outcomes. One of the main outcomes of the computer model was that by the 2020s, you'd see a lot of patterns cross. You'd see the availability to grow food start to decline. Oil was supposed to decline in 2008. You'd start to see manufacturing per capita go down, and then you'd start to see, the business services per capita go down. You'd start to see a lot of per capita items go down, and as population exceeds, those numbers per capita, the quality of life obviously diminishes because there's less available per capita. So the state-of-the-art computer model was basically predicting the future, and computers were really cool back then because they could do things that mankind couldn't do. They could think better than mankind. Nowadays, computers get really stupid. The software can't do anything without freezing up. Back then, apparently these computers were so smart they could predict what was going to happen in the 21st century, and their predictions and their models came out to right around this period of time. And they've done updates. The Club of Rome, the study was called Limits to Growth. And the Club of Rome has since published numerous studies to kind of do a follow-up and say, okay, this is how far we've come. This is how much work we need to do. If we don't do this work, we're going to run out of our resources. So I figured what I'd do is talk about some of the areas, because some of the areas of study, some of those key points that they were bringing up, you might be able to see some trends with now. You might have seen them before, but since we're in the 2020s, I figured it'd be fun to compare them to what they thought to where we are now. So first of all, let's talk about oil, because that was supposed to reach its peak in 2008. And there's a lot of argument out there that says that we did reach peak oil around the time of 2008. And peak oil just means peak oil as far as production, where at the point where our consumption of oil exceeds the amount of oil that we're able to find and discover, and because we're not finding as much oil as we're using, supplies or reserves start to go down. And it does seem as though when you look at the resource replacement of a lot of the big oil companies, today it's really kind of the lowest it's been in a very long time. It's pretty bad. Some companies are down in the the teens to the 20% range of replacements versus what they're actually producing and putting out. The oil industry actually had a big change. Back in 2015, we started discovering a lot of shale oil. It's not that we discovered it, but we were able to get that oil out of the ground. And if you remember the fracking boom from in the 2015 range, and then the immediate bust thereafter, what happened was it was too expensive to get the oil out of the ground, and our companies couldn't compete with the prices coming from OPEC, and it ultimately caused the failure in the fracking system. But with fracking, technically the U.S. could be one of the top oil and gas producers in the world. You don't think of the U.S. that way. You think of a desert producing those big, barrels of crude oil. But shale oil is actually a very big industry. And if you look at 2019's oil and gas production out of the U.S. far exceeded anything it did in 2015 before that oil and shale bust. So the U.S. is no longer a small fish in the oil and gas industry. I don't think it ever really was, but we imported a lot more in history than we have now. In fact, if you look at the charts, we're almost energy independent now. We don't import nearly as much as we used to, which is fantastic. But overall, the U.S. is probably one of the top 3 oil and gas producers because of the fracking industry. As much as people don't like fracking, that's the reality of it, and it has drastically extended the life of energy resources that we have. Now, all that being said, the replacement ratios do kind of stink, and there's only so much oil that you can possibly discover. And then after a while, I mean, who knows? Maybe there's some hidden deep within the earth or something. I don't know. But right now, the replacement ratios are not looking good. And so, in theory, what you'll have is, from this point forward, a lot more controversy over oil and gas reserves globally, really. If you look at the South China Sea, a lot of that is over oil. And if the Arctic, a lot of the issues with the Arctic is over oil. A lot of people think the Middle East is all about oil, but I think that has a lot to do with stability as well. And obviously, the larger world leaders want to have the strongest influence they can in every part of the world that they can. So, that has a lot to do with conflicts in the Arctic, the South China Sea, and the Middle East as well. Just having the presence of power where the resources are and the influence over those countries. In any case, I would say that oil and gas is going to become more valuable in the near future. So you could pretty much expect prices to rise a little bit based on that. But the truth is that we'll probably never run out of oil, because as the price of oil goes up, alternative technologies will become more affordable and people will use less oil. And so there will come a point in time when we stop utilizing oil because of that price gap. And that's something that I think a lot of people forget, is that, when oil runs out, as it runs out, there'll be an adjustment period into alternative technologies for energy. From an investment perspective, I think oil is a risky investment, because even though it would appear that the reserve replacement ratio is declining, there's always the threat of overproduction. And as we know with financial markets, nobody ever cares about where the futures go, and they just care about where it is right now. So overproduction of oil could be tricky business. If you wanted a safe commodity to invest in during commodities boom, I would always go with gold. Come on. Another big one for the 20s is going to be food. Food, they said on the report, would peak in 2020. Arguably, though, with the weather patterns we've had from the grand solar minimum, I'm not so sure that 2020 was the peak for food production. If we continue to see the solar cycle go in the direction it's been going, which is lower solar activity, then we very well may have just seen the peak of food production in 2018. 2019 wasn't a fantastic year. Food per capita in 2019 was actually a horrible year. So anybody who's done their research and actually Google searched, for things like famine, starvation, food prices, what you'll find is just a slew of information and articles coming out throughout 2019 and adding up going into 2020. Food prices shot up in 2019. I didn't think they were going to shoot up until 2020, but by the end of 2019, we've already started to see famine across the world. For the first time, we saw the food price index shoot through the roof in November. The UN came out and said, we've seen a J curve, not just in population, but we've also seen a J curve in food prices and starvation. It's turned a corner. It's going back up. Starvation is now a problem again. And starvation is a problem because crops are being hurt. But as Americans, you don't hear about it because nobody ever pays attention to the smaller countries. But you need to think about it because as that spreads, it will eventually hit your homeland, wherever that may be. Europe, America, Canada, Australia. Australia has been suffering. It's eventually going to impact you. So you should be paying attention to what else is going on in the world. Famine and starvation has been growing throughout the world in 2019. Food prices have been going up throughout the world in 2019. There were crop failures throughout 2019. There have been crop failures in Brazil during this growing season. Brazil, they're expecting a corn shortage by May 2020, and that's a warning from Brazil's own government agencies saying we're running low on corn. If you want it, you better order it now. Even here in the US, corn was a big controversy last year. We weren't growing that much corn. Corn prices weren't going up. If you look at the charts at the end of last year, the corn prices around the world went up. They just didn't go up here in the US. That's what I call manipulation. Crop failure, just food does not look good right now. To put it plainly, food does not look good. And a lot of the forecasts are for food to get worse. I've read several Motley Fool articles talking about the prices of grains and foods and commodities going up throughout the next decade. Barron's had an article talking about wheat possibly going up as much as 40% next year, and there have been a lot of research studies that show that wheat tends to go way up on years of minimum solar activity. There've just been a whole lot of articles talking about food prices and what's going to happen going into next year. It's an unbelievable amount of information. And crops, a lot of analysts are expecting 2020 to be a tough year for crops. Maybe we get lucky and we have a good growing year. Nobody really knows. You can't forecast the future, but what we do know is that food prices have skyrocketed. In November of last year, the Fao Food Report showed a 9% increase in food prices. And actually, they just came out with their report today. Let me see what it says. Yeah, FAO Food Price Index hits its highest level in 5 years. So food per capita is a struggle right now, and it continues to become a struggle. Part of the problem with the food price index are the food ingredients. A lot of the ingredient pieces have gone up. Grains, corn, vegetable oils, palm oil, as we know, has gone way up. And so the uncertainty of food looks to be more of an immediate problem than energy, oil and gas. I mean, food is definitely something that we're running out of. This looks like an apple tree. I think I have an apple tree. I don't want to hurt that. I'm talking about food, and I think I've got an apple tree here. Anyway, so oil and gas is one of those things that we don't want to not think about because it's obviously a problem, but the food index, the food price index, has been skyrocketing. There have been food shortages globally. China can't feed their population. In developed countries like the US, we tend to not think about these problems because food is 6 to 10% of the household income. Who really cares? But when it goes up to 15, 20, 30%, then you're really gonna care. Places like China, they're already at 30, 40% and just skyrocketing. I mean, the food price index is a very, very big concern globally. Everybody knows, energy, yes, you're gonna have some turbulence, some difficult times if you don't have enough energy. but there is nothing worse than not having enough food. That's when people start acting irrational. And we're starting to see these events globally. It has nothing to do with anthropogenic warming. Solar minimum periods throughout history have caused dramatic changes in our weather patterns. And those dramatic changes in our weather patterns screw with our growing season. They cut it short. It makes it virtually impossible to be able to utilize all the land that we do have to grow foods on, to grow productive crops. There are a lot more crop losses during solar minimums, and that's what some of these reports on the correlation between wheat prices and solar minimum, that's exactly what it is. It's changes in our weather patterns that become more extreme. We've known about this since the 1970s. We've known about it actually before the 1970s, but the same reports that came out in the 1970s that were talking about population growth, their biggest concern was an event like a longer solar minimum period. Their biggest concern was going into a period of instability in our climate, and we're there right now. It has nothing to do with anthropogenic warming. In fact, if you go back and you read the National Security Memorandum 200 from 1974, they believe population growth is widely recognized within the government as a current danger of the highest magnitude, calling for urgent measures. This is a sense of urgency, the highest sense of national security ever. So how do they serve this purpose? If you have a population that just cares about consuming and living a good old life, so how do you then get people on board to start taking a social responsibility to their actions, to creating a family, to giving birth? How do you stop a natural progress from progressing? They talked about creating a populist propaganda, basically, to get people to want to take it upon themselves to reduce population, to be more responsible, because what they're afraid of is the population would get too big, we'd hit a period of time where it's difficult to grow crops, and it would cause major problems, which is where we are now. World Population Plan of Action is not self-enforcing and will require vigorous efforts by interested countries, UN agencies, and other international bodies to make it effective. So they come up with another brilliant idea. The development of a worldwide political and popular commitment to population stabilization is fundamental to any effective strategy. So they created this ideal, this system of propaganda, which has turned into the AGW argument. That whole entire thing kind of grew from that time frame up until now. But their biggest concern back then actually had more to do with solar cycles. They felt like the period of time that we were in was abnormal, and they thought that we would be returning to a period more similar to the 1600s up till the 1800s. It was a lot more unstable. It was nearly, you couldn't grow the amount of crops that we are growing now. And the other problem there is that with the amount of crops we're growing now, the population is so big that any issues at all and people aren't going to eat. And that's why you're seeing the food price index go up. That's why you're starting to see, these stories of famine, these stories of starvation. Global starvation was actually on the decline up until the last 2 years. And then it kind of took a J curve and is going back up. And a lot of it has to do with crop losses in 2019. A lot of it has to do with just the simple fact that population was growing too fast. You combine those two factors together and you have the perfect storm. And that's where I think we are with food production. I think in the 20s, food is a commodity that's going to go through the roof. And I don't know what that's going to do as far as, social imbalances or how that's going to work, but it's probably going to be pretty bad because people react badly when they're starving. Global manufacturing is another one. Manufacturing index has been down for quite some time. It doesn't look like it's going to improve much. I would say that, the way that we have been used to doing business and the way business is going to be done in the future is drastically going to change. The manufacturing index probably has seen the peak of its days. People say that the manufacturing index going down isn't a big deal, but historically, it has always been a very big economic factor of going into a possible recession. Starting to turn it. So I think it's a pretty big deal. I think it's definitely an indicator that we shouldn't leave ignored. The other big one is business services. And this is a tricky area because with, you know, the technology boom that we've had, business services appears to be growing just in a different way than what we're maybe historically used to, what would be the historical norm for us. We have to just take this further down. But when you look at business services, irregardless of how well new businesses that are kind of popping up here and there from changes in the global economy, nothing can change the fact that the financial services industry is on literally the brink of collapse. And a lot of people have messaged me about Deutsche Bank and how they're causing it. I talked a bit in my last video on the financial industry about the China banks and how I think they're causing some of the problems that we have. But one thing that I didn't talk about was JP Morgan Chase. See, in my perspective, all the banks are in the same bucket of, you know what I'm thinking. When the repo markets first started having problems, we heard a lot about how over-regulation was causing the problems. But if you look at JP Morgan and their books, they have nearly halved the amount of liquid assets and cash on hand. And they've gotten so low to the point that they couldn't participate in the repo market last September, where normally they would have to the tune of, you know, $300 to $400 billion. They were down around 127, $130 billion. Everybody's wondering where the big hole came from. And I'm not saying it's all JP Morgan Chase, but I'm just saying JP Morgan is a prime example of how our banks aren't over-regulated. Nobody's regulating them at all. They're back to where they were in 2008, 2007, way over-leveraged, and they've got everything in risky investments. They say sovereign debt on their books. What does that mean? Are they buying China's debt? Greece? Are they taking bets on Europe? Because we all know how the Brexit's going to affect sovereign debt. JP Morgan, in my opinion, is a $1.5 trillion bank, and most of their assets being in quote-unquote risky investments. It's a bit scary. But I would say the initial fallout of the repo market could have been, you know, partially due to JP Morgan Chase because of the fact that they couldn't participate anymore. But I'm guessing it was more of a gradual thing. I'm guessing a lot of banks have reduced their balance sheets in what would be deemed cash and safe securities over the last several years. 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's going now. I watched this log is so old I'm only gonna get like 2 boards out of it. Is it worth it? Anything salvageable supply-wise is worth it. Use the exterior wood for firewood. Use the interior good stuff for boards. Oak is a little different because it's a hardwood dries out quickly and cracks, and it's not easy to work with. So yeah, I mean, if we're looking at all these different things, population growth going off the charts, food production, a major disruption in food production coming up, especially with the minimum. Then you look at the replacement reserve ratio of things like crude oil. Of course, you know, there still might be a lot of significant discoveries with shale oil. You look at the manufacturing index and it's just kind of going away. It's actually in a recessionary zone. I mean, it's basically down below, you know, economic expansion, and that's not necessarily good. It doesn't speak volumes for the economy. And then when you look at the business services, the banking industry, I would say that we're on the verge of a very big financial disruption and a massive spike in commodity prices. And the thing is that none of this necessarily means the end of the world. None of it means complete chaos and fighting, although people will probably fight over it. The Pentagon said that by 2020, the commodities would spike, resources would become scarce, and we'd return to war times to try and it would be the World War III fight for global resources. And I'd say that fight's been going on now for a while. They've been fighting over the South China Sea, the Arctic, wherever there's resources that are left untapped. The larger powers of the world have been trying to establish a presence, and they're fighting over that presence. And that's just, you know, that's what it is. They're focused on this finite world scenario. But the only thing at the end of the day that it actually impacts or changes is the way that we live our lives, the way that we spend our money. There's definitely going to be a change in consumer spending in 2020. There's definitely going to be a change in how much food costs in 2020. And if you don't grow your food, you might not be able to find very much of it. There's definitely going to be a change in, you know, energy production. We may see a faster shift to alternative technologies, although, you know, even alternative technologies rely on resources from the earth that, you know, we'll eventually start to have to find more of. But the second we start the transition from a consumer-based economy into, you know, a different type of economy, who knows what that's going to be yet, it's going to cause a lot of havoc because people don't like change. That's all it is. They don't want to give up the lifestyles that they have. They don't want to give up consumer spending. People are going to cry about it, and it's going to take some time to adjust. But an adjustment is coming. A major adjustment is coming. People have called the adjustment coming larger than, you know, the fall of Rome. And it's everywhere you look. Financial markets, manufacturing indexes, when you go into, you know, oil and gas reserves. And again, like I said, I think that ultimately we'll never run out of oil and gas, because as that price increases, you'll start to see more alternative energies become more affordable, and people will shift to the more affordable options. So you'll never actually run out of one over the other. The biggest thing that I see coming up in the near future that should have people a little on edge is mainly the global food supply. It's definitely in check right now, and it's definitely causing food prices to skyrocket. We've just seen so many changes in the climate over the past year, so many weather patterns that have disrupted crops. The African swine flu, it was obviously a big deal. It took out a lot of the pork and caused a major disruption in the protein market. So we're not in a great position with food, and that's where I think, you know, we need to start, you know, supporting our agricultural industry, looking at regenerative farming practices, and really, I would say that one of the biggest changes we're going to see in the 20s is people start to have to rely on themselves. I think that that's what's coming. And Lord knows that won't be good. In any case, I'll probably do a lot more videos this year talking about how to adapt to the changes that are coming, and we'll keep discussing these changes in food prices, these changes in commodity prices, and hopefully, keep people in the loop so that when these things happen, they're not surprised. But we're definitely going into a different period of time, something that you've never seen before, and you have the unlimited resources to deal with it if you put your mind to work and you utilize it. Trust me, the life that I'm living right now is completely different than the life that I lived, 10, 12 years ago. And I absolutely love it. And to be honest with you, I used to make a lot of money, but I never, ever felt just the abundance of supply and goodness in this world until I made a decision to do what I'm doing now, to get out of that hustle and bustle, that life of, living the consumer dream and actually getting out and doing things on my own, trying to supply my family on our own. And even from a standpoint of income, we went through a time where, things were extremely tough, and, in ways we're still coming out of that, but we've, grown tremendously, and there's so many opportunities out there. There's never an end to anything. I think that there are a lot of people out there who believe that, the apocalypse is around the corner. And I would urge those people to go back and actually read, what, those Bible quotations are talking about, what Matthew 24 is talking about, because it's not the end of the world. It's a period of revelation. It's a period of waking up and seeing the greater good, the truth. And whether you're spiritual or not, we all are going to come to that point in time where we're going to have to know the truths about ourselves. One of the things that I will say that's important is independent thinking. The 2020s is a time for thinkers. It's a time for people to utilize their independent power of knowledge, their ability to learn, to become wise, and figure out the opportunities that are out there. Because any time that you have systematic changes, like what so many people are expecting in the 20s, that you have opportunity. And we've seen this throughout the history of the US, we've seen this throughout the history of the world. Any time of a systematic change, any time of changes that are being driven by changes in our climate, changes in our growing patterns, it presents itself with opportunity. The global fight for these resources has blinded mankind. The education programs, or should I say the education camps globally, have divided politics amongst the populaces in every country to the point of extremism, to where people don't think on their own. They don't want to be independent. They feel like they need to be a part of these groups. Everybody wants to be an advocate. Nobody is thinking clearly anymore. And that, to me, is the largest threat of 2020. Nothing else is really that big of a threat. There's always a way to move forward. There's always a way to make it through a grand solar minimum event. We have in the past, but if we wanted to do it in a harmonious fashion, it almost seems like everything that we have done up until this point to prevent it has made the situation 10 times worse than it actually is. And those who are able to think independently have an unusual opportunity to succeed, one that is far beyond any opportunity that has ever been given to society. This is the first time in history where we are actually standing at a pivot point, where those who are able to think, those who are able to be prepared, and those who are able to make their own steps could be the pillars of society as society grows and changes through the next decade and the decade after that.